A new report by a global industry body shows that the coronavirus disruption could cost African Airlines about $40 million in revenue this year. This is a potentially devastating hit to often struggling airlines counting on lucrative Chinese routes to fund their expansion. Airlines around the world have suspended or modified flights after the outbreak of the coronavirus, which began in mainland China late last year and has now spread to more than 60 countries around the world. Joining me in the studio to discuss this and more is the CEO of Alpha African Advisory, Mrs. Sanyade Okoli. You're welcome. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for joining us. So let's begin with, as far as the airline, are they doomed? Because we talked about South African Airlines a while back, the bailouts, unemployment, all the other issues. And we know the African struggles. You know them well. The African struggle, airline struggle. Can they survive this? Is this the worst time this could be happening?
It's definitely not a good time. Are they doomed? I'd say no, because the reality is that air travel is just run of the mill now. Everybody travels. Right. You know what I mean? So it's not like as a result of the viruses, we're all going to stop traveling permanently. But it does put a lot of pressure on an already challenged situation, because the reality is IATA in December had forecast that the African Airlines will make a loss of about $200 million this year, similar to last year. So they were already pre-coronavirus in a loss, significant loss position. And obviously that differs with, between airlines. So Kenya Airways, South African Airways, they're making a loss. Obviously South African Airways a lot more. But Ethiopian Airlines, they've been more profitable. So there are differences between the airlines, but generally, yes, it is a very difficult, it's a bad time for them.
I wanted to get your take on the World Health Organization coming out to say that travel restrictions in this time are not advisable, which I was a bit surprised to read that, because one of the effects of this, or what's been hitting them hard, of course, is that routes have been cut off, people aren't traveling, but then a lot of these countries are directing airlines to not fly to China, not fly to Italy, Iran, all these other countries. But the World Health Organization, the WHO, came out and said, well, no, you shouldn't do that. What's your take on it?
If you think about it, what's the worst thing you can do in a crisis? Panic.
Panic, right, panic.
And a lot of us, businesses, individuals, etc., are taking actions based on fear, based on panic. And what WHO is saying is that could have other implications. So, for example, if you stop flights going in and out of a particular place, you might inadvertently stop skilled workers, health workers, medication, and other things that are required, being able to get to that location easily. And the reality is, when they look at the risk factors, I think it's less of a case of banning travel and more ensuring, like what you were showing there with Nigeria, putting in place effective systems at the ports to monitor who's coming in, rather than saying nobody can come in. So it kind of makes sense. Yeah. And I know it's scary, the way this, I was going to say pandemic, but then there's still a question, is it or isn't it a pandemic? So I've got to be careful what I use. But the way this virus has spread, I recognize that, but I think there's definitely a need for us to make informed, rational decisions, not based on fear. So
you corrected me last time. I was going to ask if you're going to invest in a certain venture. You're like, hey, no, it's advisory, right?
Yes.
Would you, let's say, if one African nation now wants to float a new airline, would you advise them to, because, I mean, populations are growing, more people are flying. Would you advise them to?
Okay, so, I said we did start as a private equity business. So some 12, 13 years ago, we did look quite seriously at investing in an airline.
Okay.
It's not an easy business. It
thin
really
margins.
Is very, very thin margins, and, highly risky.
Right.
So you really have to be very, very certain about the business model for the specific airline before you invest.
Good advice. Good advice. It's going to be, we have to definitely keep a watch on how these things turn out. All right, we're going to switch now from the airline aviation industry over to East Africa, to Kenya, some budget issues and debt issues that's going on. So according to a parliamentary report, Kenya needs to increase its foreign reserves in order to keep up with repayment obligations on mounting external debt in East Africa's biggest economy. A 10-year, $2 billion Eurobond raised by Kenya in 2014 matures in 2024. Other foreign currency debt repayments which are due include repaying the loan for a Chinese-built railway. The report says servicing these debts will likely put pressure on foreign income because of the need to finance obligations. So, of course, we're still with the CEO of Alpha African Advisors, Ms. Sanyade Okoli. What's Kenya's debt picture looking like?
Okay, well, we're talking about Kenya, but we won't be picking on Kenya.
Right, right, of course not.
Because the reality for a lot of countries across the continent, the debt burden has actually been increasing.
Right.
But in Kenya's favor, my understanding is a lot of that debt has actually been to invest in infrastructure.
Right.
Because there's, if you're having a budget deficit, there's almost like a good deficit and a bad deficit.
Right.
i.e., is that deficit an investment such that you expect it to yield growth and yield revenue, etc.? So will it generate income to be able to pay off that debt later?
Right.
Or what I would call a bad deficit, which is when you're spending it on recurring expenses, etc., which is essentially money down a hole.
Right.
So as I said, in Kenya's favor, it would appear that a lot of it has gone into infrastructure spend.
There's another large country that you and I both know about. They have pretty much the same issue, and their debt is going into...
We will not be picking on the other large country. Today, I will not pick on that country.
So we'll leave that other country alone, but it's a fascinating discussion if you look at that.
Yeah.
Okay, well, you know what? Well, quick follow-up.
Okay.
Kenyatta, President Kenyatta, he's actually been criticized by a number of Kenyans, saying that he's borrowing too much. But as you've stated, it's for infrastructure. So...
But yes, but then there is such a thing as borrowing too much.
Right.
So again, when it's very easy, and speaking of that country,
yeah, that other country,
Nigeria, that is, people look at, okay, what's the debt to GDP ratio?
Right.
Which is a fair enough metric, but I think for a lot of these countries where we are today, an even more important metric is your debt service versus your revenue. Because even though debt to GDP, depending on how much of the GDP is government driven. Yes, debt to GDP might not seem so high, but because of the revenues of government, they may struggle to actually service the debt. So that's what they have to consider. And there's also the timing of when the debts become repayable. So you talked about the Eurobonds expanding in 2024. If I remember rightly, it's about 30-something% of their domestic debt that expires today. So it's about absolute debt, but also the affordability of the debt.
Okay, excellent. Another thing that's been said is that Kenya relies a little too much on diaspora remittances. What's the risk there that you...
The concern there is that immigration policies have been changing across the world. And even when we're talking about other economies, it's not that other economies always grow, right? It's not that the other economies are not susceptible to recessions, etc. So their concern is that Kenya is being dependent on factors they cannot totally control.
Okay. So that could dry up.
It just increases the risk factor.
Okay. All right. So now, with regards to the central bank building up its reserves, it's been understood that they have a 4-month plan where they want to buy foreign exchange from commercial banks. It's one of the strategies that they're looking at. What do you think about that strategy?
To be honest, I'm not certain. So if you look at the debt trend for Kenya and the foreign reserves trend, you have seen the debt going up.
Right.
Over the last, let's take a 5-year historic picture.
Okay.
And reserves hasn't really gone up that much. So part of that concern is, fine, you're increasing the debt, but you're going to have to service that debt,
right,
especially when you're looking at foreign debt, which has been growing in terms of a percentage of the total debt.
Yes.
Will you be able to afford it? So that is the concern. I don't know how much USD there is in the Kenyan banking system to be able to support the level of reserves increase they're talking about. I really don't know the answer, but certainly one eyebrow raised, and let's hope they have a clear plan.
Okay, so speaking of a clear plan, right? why not diversify your FX income streams? I mean, everybody talks. We keep saying these things, right? Because I don't know about the strategy with buying FX on commercial banks. I mean, as you said, there has to be a ceiling there somewhere. So diversify your exports. So, export something else.
To which I would
bring in more dollars.
To which I would say, physician, heal thyself. Because you are living in a country that has
right.
been talking about diversifying its income for at least the last 5 years, but we all know it's actually a lot longer. And we realize it's actually not that easy.
Right.
So if you look at the Kenyan economy, about roughly, say, 37% of its GDP is to do with agric, some for local consumption, but we also know they export quite a bit. They're looking at manufacturing. You might say, well, their spend on infrastructure might actually help with the manufacturing. But
okay.
I'm sure that is one of their plans, but easier said than done.
Very, very true. It's always great to have you, Mrs. Sanyade Okoli, the CEO of Alpha Africa Capital. Thank you so much.